All right. Thank you all so much for joining us today. We really appreciate it. Today, we're talking about Michael Sobolik's book, Countering China's Great Game, A Strategy for American Dominance. And for those of you who do not have the pleasure of knowing Michael Sobolik, he is a senior fellow in the Indo-Pacific Studies with the American Foreign Policy Council. His book primarily covers American-Chinese grand strategy, and we're so lucky to have him today. And I'm in particular very excited because he is really spot on in not only his analysis, but in a sort of take no prisoners when it comes to CCP apologists kind of way, which I really appreciate. So before we dive into my questions, I'd love, Michael, if you could give us a short overview of your book and tell us about the impetus for creating and writing a book about a strategy to counter China.
Sure. Thank you so much, Anne, and for Vandenberg for hosting this event. We were just talking a couple of minutes ago before we went live, but I remember a number of years ago when Vandenberg was stood up, uh, just having such respect for the organization's mission, for the people that gravitated to the organization, for the people that are on staff and in leadership. So it's an honor for me to be part of this conversation with Vandenberg. So thank you for hosting. With the book and the impetus for writing it, when I was in the United States Senate as basically Ted Cruz's China guy for 5 years, from 2014 to 2019, that was right around the time when our foreign policy towards the People's Republic of China began to shift away from unmitigated cooperation to this growing awareness that, oh no, like we thought 3.5 decades ago that if we engaged China economically, we could change them politically, but they hadn't really changed at all. It was more authoritarian, more threatening, and more dangerous. And if anything, they were changing us with their malign influence inside of America. And there was a growing awareness of that. And I think Congress was starting to legislate on those problems. But I noticed as a Senate staffer that none of the legislation and really none of the rhetoric about China really focused on the Chinese Communist Party's weaknesses. A lot of the focus was on all of the ways that the CCP had either infiltrated America, had exploited our vulnerabilities, or how US companies operating inside of China were, like, without even knowing it or without meaning to, part of human rights abuses and related problem sets like that. But there wasn't really this examination of where is Beijing weak. And if you believe that we're in a Cold War with the CCP, which I firmly believe we do, and that's the starting point of countering China's great game, you don't win Cold Wars just by playing good defense. Like you have to have a plan to make your adversary uncomfortable, to force them to compete on terrain that they're not strong in. And when I left the Hill and went to AFPC, I decided I wanted to devote a lot of time to building out a blueprint for what that would look like. And what came out on the other end of that was countering China's great game.
Which, that's sort of one of the best parts about the book is not just recognizing that, China is this strong, incredibly threatening power, but there are areas that are worth exploiting. Um, so obviously, I want to get to your writing, but I would be remiss if I didn't mention the introduction to your book, which was written by Vandenberg Advisory Board member Matt Pottinger, and he mentions Ronald Reagan's concept of candor, which is about being honest when we're dealing with who our enemies are. And one of the things I feel like your book does really well is being honest about what they're doing and being honest about what we're not doing. So could you tell us a little bit more about what we need to be honest with ourselves on both ends?
Sure. So when Matt wrote uh, his really generous foreword for the book, he pulled this Reagan quote that I had never seen before or heard before, but it was something along the lines of, when democracy cease telling the truth about tyranny, we cease telling the truth to ourselves. And this is something that Matt and also Mike Gallagher, former chairman of the select committee on the CCP, both of them have been sounding the same note repeatedly over the past couple of weeks. And I think they call it the Pottinger paradox, which is the more deferential you are to Leninist totalitarian regimes, the more destabilizing and the more threatening they actually become. And I think this is the value of candor when it comes to our relationship with the Chinese Communist Party. It is actually a stabilizing thing for America to tell the truth about the nature of the party, what Xi Jinping is trying to accomplish around the world, and why we need to stop them. And I remember a couple of years ago, um, a National Review got a really interesting story about how the State Department was censoring, or not censoring, but was shying away from any mention of the Chinese Communist Party in any official State Department documents. They were only focusing on the People's Republic of China or the government of China. You can't really understand Beijing today apart from the party. You can't understand the government of China without the single party dictatorship that controls it. And we seem to be very hesitant to be open about the political reality inside of modern China today. And I think that's really unfortunate because it's one of the biggest sources of asymmetric advantage that we have. Like Xi Jinping is literally terrified of what some random person in China could post on the internet tomorrow. The US president doesn't care what millions of Americans are going to tweet in opposition to him tomorrow. Like our system can handle that, but theirs can't. And I think candor is not only advantageous for us, it also hits the CCP where they're vulnerable, and I think it could very well have a deterrent effect. So Matt wrote beautifully, I think, in the opening pages of the book about that, and I just couldn't agree more with him.
Right. And I think, an interesting point. How can we confront an adversary that we aren't even willing to name in the first place? I think the ability to say, not only is this nation an adversary, but what a lot of their doings are is perpetuating evil. So I think a part of naming your adversary, there's also an element of needing to know your adversary. And your book does a really great job of walking through historical explanations of a lot of China's self-conceptualizations, and does a really good job of dispelling falsehoods. One that I found particularly interesting was that, some people look at China historically and claim that it's an isolationist nation and there's not a lot of desire to expand. Um, but you sort of explain that China described the idea of China being all under heaven, that actually means the whole world. So could you explain a little bit of how that historical mentality plays out today?
Gladly. So when Xi Jinping took the reins of power in 2012, 2013, he gave this seminal speech. And in it, he talked about what it meant for the People's Republic of China to return to greatness. Like the rhetorical trope "Make America Great Again" is pervasive inside the United States today. China has their own version of that, and it's couched not only in the path from Mao Zedong to Deng Xiaoping to Xi Jinping, where Mao established the PRC, Deng Xiaoping helped China become wealthy, and now Xi Jinping is making China strong. Like that narrative is a well-documented one in the China policy space in the United States.
Mhm.
But there's also the historical context of what is commonly called the century of humiliation, how like not that long ago, Western imperial powers carved and divvied China up, like European imperial powers in particular. And understandably, like that left a very poor taste in China's mouth. And like in terms of historical grievances, I think it's useful to understand some of the unjust things that China has suffered over the years historically, like well before the CCP ever entered. But what is really missing inside of Washington is an understanding that like China's history didn't start in 1949,
Right.
nor did it start in the 19th century. Like I think there's this kind of unspoken belief with Americans, like we're such a young country, and it's easy for us to assume that history for the whole world began when history began for America. And that can either look like only studying China from 1949 on, which kind of coincides with the end of the Second World War and when America entered as a huge preeminent power. But we also have this tendency of, if we do go back further into China's past, we don't really go any further past that century of humiliation, which was not that long after the United States became a nation. And we seem to have what I think is kind of an understandable challenge to go into antiquity and to understand that China does not see itself in the timeline of human existence like America does. China traces its history back to the time of Christ and before, which is hard to compute again as an American because we don't have a frame of reference for that with our nation or our strategic culture or anything. But China does. And that's actually really good news for us if we're locked in a Cold War with them, because what you need about your adversary in a Cold War is data. You need to know what makes them tick, why they behave the way they do, and what narrative they see themselves living out in the world. America has our own version of that, like the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, Washington's farewell address, our journey through the Civil War, entering the 20th century as a growing economic power, what it means to be an exemplar of liberty and also a defender of liberty, like that tension in our own history. Like we have our own story. China has their own story too. And I think it's overlooked and really important. Like if you look in from the first Chinese dynasty on, um, these recurring challenges of how do we keep a political entity as big and diverse and unwieldy as China unified. It's a huge problem set that continues today in China. What does political legitimacy look like in China? It looks nothing like it does in the United States or in Western civilization. And like these questions might sound theoretical, and admittedly, they kind of are. But when you talk about understanding why a nation behaves the way they do and how they see themselves in the world, it's not just theoretical, it's quite practical.
Mhm.
And the strategic culture of China, which is what I argue quite poignantly and pointedly in the book, I do think there is a constant strategic culture that you can trace from the CCP back through much of China's dynastic period. And it is really reduced to this never-ending quest to match what China sees as it at its civilizational superiority and to turn that into unrivaled political power.
Mm.
And the ability to do that is what constitutes legitimacy, which is quite different from the American conception of political legitimacy, like rights derived from God, government, governing from the consent of the governed. Like these are two entirely different pictures. But with China, uh, it's predisposed them to be quite expansionary, with matching their civilizational greatness with political control. And I trace that extensively in chapter 2. From the first to the final Chinese dynasty, China expanded by a factor of 4. Like, this is not an isolationist entity at all. Much of that expansion was due to wars of aggression. Uh, and if we want to get into more detail in Q&A later on, happy to do that. But I think like Imperial China on average never knew a year without war. I think that's an important data point.
No, definitely an important data point and a good reminder to everyone in the audience. As a reminder, when questions do come to you, be sure to drop them in the chat, and we can get to them later. And I think your points are all incredibly well taken. I think there is a tendency, especially within the United States' own isolationist movement, to sort of assume that a lot of our adversaries don't have expansionist designs, and that's not necessarily the case. We're seeing that obviously in other parts of the world, and I think it would be a mistake to assume that China is very similar in that respect. Um, when thinking about, as you mentioned, the strategic culture and how the United States doesn't always have a conceptualization beyond a certain amount of time, I think one of our problems is that um, we've also benefited from a lot of prosperity recently, and we've been the global hegemon. And so a lot of times when we're writing about Beijing's influence expanding, Americans aren't necessarily seeing that in their everyday lives and aren't necessarily, conceptualizing that, oh, this might have a larger negative effect that I'm wouldn't want to happen. So could you tell us a little bit about, using examples from your book, what a world in which the CCP would dominate would look like?
When I was a Senate staffer, I think this was probably in 2017, maybe 2018, I had a meeting with the president of a world-renowned cancer research institute from Texas. And he flew up to Washington, came to the Senate, and he approached our office because, again, I work for a Texas member of Congress, and this is a state-of-the-art cancer research institute in Texas. And he sat down with me and he said, "We have a problem in our facility. We have roughly 63 different departments. Of those 63, about 47 of them are compromised." What he meant by that were that in around that number, at least one person in those departments was affiliated with China's Thousand Talents programs, which is one of their ways to attract research talent, primarily in STEM fields, away from the West, America in particular, into Beijing. It's their way to get sensitive research, basic research, applied research, and have their institutes, their universities, and their labs benefit from it before anyone else, and then they can file a patent on it before anyone else can. And there's that whole angle to it. But there's also a safety angle here too. And he keyed in on the radiology department, and he said, "We have discovered that they are trying to pilfer research that has to do with mass immunization of population centers to radiation." And if you
Mm.
translate that into war speak, China was testing the proposition of whether or not they can make their entire population immune to the effects of nuclear war and fallout. And they were hunting for that technology in Texas, in the United States. And that was a really heavy conversation to have as like a 20-something-year-old Senate staffer who was still, learning where the bathrooms were. um, that I think I probably lost a few hairs on my head after that meeting. But that to me was one of my own personal wake-up calls of, oh, the world that I feel so accustomed to living in is very quietly, but also quite deliberately changing. And I think you made just such an important point when you said that Americans often don't even see how Beijing's malign influence has already pervaded the world we live in and the nation we live in. Um, I talk a little bit about TikTok in the book, but since I finished writing the book, TikTok became I think the biggest example of the technological totalitarian world that the party is trying to build. I mean, you have this app that about half of America is on, and there's documented evidence that the CCP has depressed and censored content that they deem sensitive, and they've amplified content that helps them politically. They've used TikTok to spy on American journalists, and it is a loaded gun pointed at the heart of American democracy itself. That's a big thing to say. I do not think it's a bombastic thing to say. I think TikTok is maybe the greatest asymmetric threat that Beijing has against the United States. And it's right under our noses and sits on millions and millions of American phones. And I think this is kind of like we're realizing that for so many decades, we've lived in this globalized world where we kind of lulled ourselves to sleep and told ourselves that we didn't have any trade-offs between prosperity and security. I think that was the fundamental lie we bought into in the 90s after the Berlin Wall fell and we won the first Cold War. But now we're in a second Cold War, and it's the product of some poor choices we've made along the way.
Right, definitely. And, just touching briefly on the TikTok point, I think in listening to you speak previously, you were discussing about how, TikTok has said that they would rather shutter than have a forced divestiture. And your point was basically, now ask yourself why they would want to do that. It's connecting those dots that this is in fact a threat, and we're telling you it's a threat. And they're kind of pointing out that, yeah, this is meant to not be something for the United States benefit. Um, so obviously, hearing all of that, I assume both myself and a lot of people on this call consider themselves China hawks. But one of the most interesting parts of your book was that, the doves are strengthening the CCP, but the hawks are missing opportunities. So in a way, we're both not adequately, countering the CCP. So could you tell us a little bit more about how the China hawks are reacting rather than actually attacking?
Yes, this is one of the crucial messages at the core of the book. And I think it gets back to that primal motive that I had leaving the Senate, kind of realizing that Congress was caught in a reactive posture, which to anyone on this call, hearing someone call Congress reactive is not exactly breaking news. It's
Yeah.
the House is on like 2-year cycles. The Senate has the luxury of being on 6-year cycles, but whichever chamber you're talking about, I, I think one of the frustrating things I learned as a staffer was sometimes the comms team does more policy work than the actual policy teams do. And that's because members of Congress want to be seen as like being a leader on the issue, but you have to beat everyone else and be the first one to respond to claim that terrain. And that means you don't have time to be thoughtful in the process. And the lowest common denominator tends to pull and kind of dumb down policy in a lot of cases. And I saw that with China policy, a lot of the focus was going to super low hanging fruit, which is a good way to start building momentum. Don't get me wrong, like focusing on Confucius Institutes was a great place to start in 2017 for the Hill. Uh, and then it expanded to, oh my gosh, the universities have, again, 1,000 talent programs and these huge endowments and gifts from like CCP affiliated entities that is, curating the trips of American university students to China. Like that's should be a problem.
Mhm.
And I feel like the further down we dig, the worse it gets. Like we see how pernicious and pervasive a lot of this malign influence from Beijing is. But we cannot edit undo our way out of those problems. And what I mean by that is like we engaged China in kind of unmitigated fashion for what, like 3.5 decades or so. It's no surprise we have a ledger of problems that have built up. We need to start working our way through them, no question. But that's insufficient to win a Cold War. Like maybe another way to put it, my Dallas Mavericks are in the Western Conference Finals in the NBA. I'm from Dallas. I'm very excited right now. And there's this old adage that good defense wins basketball championships. That might be true in athletics, but in great power competition, you do not get a gold star for taking care of your homeland. Like that's the bare minimum of what any self-respecting country should do. You win Cold Wars by forcing your adversary onto unfavorable strategic terrain where you have an advantage. And the China Hawks, broadly speaking, in DC, I don't think we're there yet. I think there is such a rightly deserved focus on semiconductors, the technical side of the competition. On the investment side, like outbound investment is a huge concern. TikTok, for as important and urgent as it was, is a defensive play on our part. That's not us playing offense. It took a lot of political effort just to play good defense on TikTok. That is the problem that I see, even with the folks in DC that are rightly considering the CCP a threat. We're stuck in a reactive cycle. We are not systemically, as a policy community, asking ourselves, how can we force them to compete on terrain that they don't want to compete on? That's where I think we've got to go.
Right. And definitely. So I'm going to ask one more question related to that, and then we'll turn it over to Q&A. So if you have questions, as a reminder, feel free to put them in the Q&A box. Um, and as a St. Louisan, I have no skin in the game when it comes to the NBA playoffs. So, I hope for the best for you. Um, one of the things that it seems like is that the current administration has really this profound fear of escalation in any respect, whether it's in Ukraine or what's going on in China. And so one of the things that you suggest we need to be doing is testing the CCP on what's rhetoric and what's resolve. Um, and I think it's a really salient point because, how do we know where their red lines are if we're a little bit confused about where they're being blustery? So, what areas do you think we could lean in a little bit more to test those red lines?
Yeah, I mean, uh, I give the Biden administration high marks on their multilateral diplomacy with, oh gosh, with the Koreans, with the Japanese, with the Australians, the Indians. They've done great work with allies and partners. I think they have so badly bungled the bilateral relationship with China for the exact reason that you bring up. They're afraid of their own shadow, and they self-deter at key junctures, and they hold competitive leverage back. I think back to that Reuters piece from last summer by Michael Martina, and it was basically the price that the Biden administration paid to secure Antony Blinken's trip to Beijing. They froze additional export controls on Huawei. They delayed, and to my knowledge, I don't think they actually ever implemented new sanctions for the Uyghur genocide. And they canned the release of the FBI report on the spy balloon after lying to the American people about the existence of the spy balloon and lying about whether or not it collected intelligence on our sensitive military sites. I mean, and to top it off, they sent senior State Department officials that landed in Beijing on June 4th, the anniversary of Tiananmen Square. And it was the weakest statement from the State Department on Tiananmen Square that I've seen in years. I think that they've tripped over themselves because they think dialogue is going to produce win-win outcomes, which strangely enough is literally the CCP propaganda line of win-win diplomacy. The Biden administration thinks we live in a positive sum world. I wish we did. For everyone's sake in America, I really wish that there was a positive sum relationship with Beijing. There's not, and it only takes one party for that to not be true. And Xi Jinping has been abundantly clear that the path of China's restoration to greatness runs smack through the middle of the United States of America. You can read his own speeches to hear him say it. So I think what we need to be doing, um, aside from jettisoning this misguided diplomacy at all costs approach, you asked about testing red lines and what that looks like. China talks the CCP talks a lot about like hurting the feelings of 1.4 billion Chinese people whenever you bring up anything like human rights or censorship or whatever. Um, let's just briefly maybe talk about information. COVID should have been a Sputnik moment for America with China, and it sadly wasn't. I think we just spent more time tearing each other apart as a country than coalescing around where COVID came from. Like the CCP was more focused on stopping the information spread of the virus than they were about stopping the virus itself. And Americans died. So, like when we talk about how the party controls information and censors within their own borders, that's not just a human rights issue. That's a homeland security issue for Americans. It's also an area of asymmetric advantage because the fact that the CCP feels the need to build out this quite impressive techno totalitarian architecture from Huawei and ZTE to Hikvision, Dahua, Hytera, and all these other cutting edge technologies for surveillance, not to mention the Great Firewall. It's impressive they can do that, but it's really unimpressive that they feel the need to do that. So I think one red line that we should start testing is making it more costly and difficult for the party to control information within their own borders. When I had Matt Pottinger on my podcast a couple of years ago, I asked him, when you were deputy NatSec advisor in the White House, were we doing anything to mess with the Great Firewall or to complicate it? And he said, like publicly on the record, no, we were not doing a single thing. And I think that is not only like leverage we're leaving on the table, I think it's something that we should judiciously and prudently test, because you learn something about your adversary in the process of testing their red lines, to your point earlier. And either it's rhetoric and it's bluster, or they mean what they say, and you come to a better understanding of each other, which is stabilizing in the long run. But if it is bluster, and if there's some plausible deniability behind it as well, that gives you some room to play with. And it ideally turns them inward and creates problems for them internally at home. That I think the goal of my book is competitive strategies to distract them from their expansionist tendencies abroad. And I think testing red lines is a great way to do that.
Well, that is, first of all, a perfect transition because we've had a question come in about the CCP's expansionist designs. But before we do that, would you remind us the name of your podcast for those of us who might want to learn a little bit more?
Gladly. So the podcast is called Great Power Podcast. I recently had Mike Gallagher on the show. I had Alex Ward, the national security reporter from Politico. That episode came out yesterday, and I have some other fun ones coming up too. So please check it out: Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you listen.
As a listener, I can say it's really great. So would highly recommend it.
Thank you.
So as a reminder, you can drop questions in the chat, but other than that, I'm going to kick it off with a question. Given the CCP's expansionist designs and the power imbalance between Moscow and Beijing, could you see future tensions between China and Russia found in their competing designs for the future direction of Central Asia? Could this be furthered if the U.S., following the evacuation from Afghanistan, to be furthered over time by our exit from the region? So the reason for there being common policy of countering the U.S. hegemony would be replaced by sowing the seeds of their own division.
We, I think, sometimes overstate the nature of the relationship between Beijing and Moscow. They do have an alignment of interests currently, and I think it was just this morning the Financial Times published a story about the UK defense minister saying that they have evidence that China is providing material lethal aid to Russia in their war in Ukraine. So they have locked arms. Like we saw Putin and Xi literally hug it out with the cameras rolling a few days ago. But they're not allies either. And that is a distinction with a meaningful difference, because you don't have to go very far into recent history to find Beijing and Moscow nearly coming to nuclear blows. And if you go back a little further, just to circle back once again to China's century of humiliation in their dynastic era, China lost more of its territory to Russia than to any other nation in Europe. No one in China has forgotten that. And the Russians haven't forgotten it either. And if you look at the Russian Far East that borders China, economically and demographically, the trends are in China's favor. And I think one of the interesting parlor games that people talk about over drinks with foreign policy is when is China going to resorb its old far northern territories that is now currently Russian sovereign territory. But with Central Asia, I mean, this is so key because it is one of the most important and one of the most overlooked regions on the map. And the United States has no one to blame but itself for how we've mismanaged our diplomacy in this neighborhood of the world. We've talked a big game. Like when Hillary Clinton was Secretary of State, she had this huge Central Asian strategy, didn't go anywhere. Trump administration had big plans, didn't go anywhere. And the current administration, I think, has barely even discussed Central Asia. And we AFPC hosted a sit-down meeting with embassy officials from one of the stands a couple years ago. I won't say which one, but I asked them, how are we doing with offering you guys an alternative to China's Belt and Road? And they said, well, we recently had a project, and the interest rate that Beijing quoted us was 2%. Washington quoted us 14%. That is not a credible choice for anyone. It's an impossible choice. And of course, that they have to go with the Belt and Road in that scenario. And I think we are shooting ourselves in the foot strategically here, because the Central Asian countries, it is in their interest for us to be present, because they do not want to be dominated by Russia or by China. Us being present in Afghanistan was an enormous benefit to them. And our exit from the region left a wide open door to Moscow and Beijing. And uh, yes, their interests do converge in the medium term, and who knows, maybe even in the short term a bit, but like they need us there. Central Asian states need us to be present. If for no other reason, just to show up to these dialogues that happen. Like, we'll send the lowest level State Department officials, and the Russian foreign minister will be there. Half of foreign policy sometimes is just showing up, and we're not really even doing that in Central Asia.
Which I think is really interesting because, we've seen this, okay, we're going to pivot to China, but then, everything ends up being interconnected.
Yes.
So our next question is, what is your view on hard power versus soft power when it comes to China?
So this I have a soapbox about soft power. I'm test driving it, so well, I'll share the bit with you guys, and then if you have feedback for me, let me know. I like many foreign policy folks, when I was in grad school, we read all about soft power. We read Joseph Nye's, his several works on the topic, and a lot of research from Council on Foreign Relations and other think tanks that get into that topic too. I bristle at the concept of soft power, because when I think about power, by definition, it is not soft. Like, power is in foreign policy and in just the realm of politics. When you talk about power, you're talking about coercion, which is the ability to either get someone to do something they don't want to do, or to get them to stop doing something they're already doing. In foreign policy and national security, that is the coin of the realm. Deterrence and compellence, that is the coin of the realm with the exercise of power. What people mean when they talk about soft power is influence, which there is a distinction between power and influence, like authority and influence. Huge difference. Maybe putting the terminology of it aside, China is really has taken big steps in burnishing its credentials in the war for global influence. And again, like, to not to come back to TikTok over and over again, but like, look at Temu, look at Shein. Like, these apps that are pervasive are in effect like Chinese soft power in a way, if you want to use that term. They kind of are. And they're reaching young Americans, and young Americans are the target demographic for pop culture in the United States, which pervades around the whole world. So I do think that even though we've had the market cornered on global influence and on like the story of America, like we have a better story to tell than Beijing does, but they're finding inroads, and I think they're being quite creative with it. But the good news for us is that Temu and Sheen can't help but be implicated with Uyghur forced labor concerns. And that's ripe for exposure. Like, Saturday Night Live actually had a great skit on this over the weekend. And when you have SNL telling the truth about the Chinese Communist Party, that's a great indicator that something right is happening in the country with China. And the people who don't listen to people like Senator Warner or Senator Cruz or Senator Rubio or like all of these Republican and Democratic hawks on the Hill, they watch SNL. So I think that stuff matters a lot, but I, I think that we've really underfunded our public diplomacy. Like the Global Engagement Center at State Department is a bit of a mess,
Mhm.
unfortunately.
Well, that plays really well into our next question, which is a question I often ask myself, just because it seems like everything these days is a hair on fire kind of threat. And so, how do you capture the American people's attention? Which is what this question's about. So, what is a piece of messaging you think would recaptivate Americans' attention to this threat? Many Americans have heard for years that China is a threat, and how can we hit home our specifics for Americans?
This question, ho- honestly, at the risk of sounding overly dramatic, these are the kind of questions that kind of give me a bit of a chill because I don't know why this hasn't already happened yet. And again, to circle back to COVID, that should have been the moment for us collectively, and it wasn't. We half jokingly talked about the spy balloon as, oh, is this our new Sputnik moment? Because it was a thing in the sky, and it was a thing that like all of America was kind of participating in together, which is rare. But that came and went, just like the news cycle comes and goes. And I asked Mike Gallagher when I had him on my show recently, I kind of asked him this exact question, which was, how do you convince the American people to compete to win a Cold War before the crisis comes, before Taiwan is invaded, before we are attacked, before one of our allies that we have a mutual defense treaty with is attacked? How do you get us into that competitive posture now before it's too late? And his answer was, you need presidential leadership, which admittedly sounds like a bumper sticker because we've heard people say that our whole lives. But just kind of translating it to be a little grittier, you need somebody who campaigns in a national presidential campaign that America is in a zero-sum tussle once again with the CCP, and that we need to win for our own liberties to thrive and to be healthy and safe. We need someone who wins the presidency to make the case to the American people that Beijing is out to make the world safe for their tyranny and unsafe for our liberty. And we have not had a message of that clarity at all. We've had a lot of presidential candidates talk about how China's a currency manipulator. We've had candidates make passing references to genocide happening inside of China, which is meaningful and it matters. And I frankly am really disappointed that hasn't had a bigger impact than it already has. But that is the necessary and sufficient condition that our system kind of hinges on. You don't get systemic foreign policy change in the United States without a president who leans forward and makes the case as a priority. And the question that kind of presumes is, what is it going to take for an American candidate for president to have an incentive to do that? Which, put differently, ideally, the incentive structure should be you can't win the presidency without making that case. But a lot of things are going to have to change in our world and in our country for that incentive to become reality. Honestly, I think the world is going to have to get even more dangerous than it already is, which is unpleasant, but I don't know another way.
Right, right. Well, I'm going to use the moderator's privilege and ask a question that then I have, because we had a couple questions come in that I think will be great to end on rather than the one I had planned. So obviously this year is an election year. You're talking about the use of presidential leadership in terms of communicating what exactly the CCP threat looks like. So if you were to take one piece of advice from your book and give it to a future administration, what would you point to?
Um, if if I had the opportunity to advise the Biden administration, I would counsel them that while their their desire to stabilize the relationship is a good one, I would reframe how they think about stabilizing the relationship. Um, what they are doing right now is making things worse and not better. They are signaling to the CCP that we lack the resolve to stand in their way. And I think that the Biden administration, unfortunately, to really take a stand like that, is going to have to give up a lot of the diplomatic work that they have accrued thus far with these bilateral working groups they have with Beijing. Just look at Nancy Pelosi's trip to Taiwan a few years ago. As soon as she came home, China canceled all the working groups they had with the State Department. The Biden administration would view that as a diplomatic failure. I think you can reframe it and look at it as a sign of strategic tactical success, that you're actually moving in the right direction and giving them the right signals. Don't know if they'd be receptive to that though. But if President Trump returns to the White House, I would, I think, say two things. Number one, uh, you pursuing a deal of any sort, whether it's an economic deal or some other deal, with the PRC is not inherently bad in and of itself. What matters is what are you seeking to secure, and what price are you willing to pay to secure it. And I would also counsel, related to that, that you've got to know what you're not willing to give away. And Taiwan has to be something that President Trump is not willing to give away. And nobody.
Which perfectly leads into our next question.
Oh, lovely.
Right. Um, how would you describe the likelihood of China invading Taiwan, or is this just rhetoric from both internal or external consumption?
It's not rhetoric. The I think that we are fools if we do not take Xi Jinping at his word. When I say we, I mean collectively U.S. policymakers, not the person who asked the question. I say that to underscore the grave seriousness of Taiwan. This is the new East and West Berlin divide in our country, in our world today. Taiwan is the fault line. It is the fault line and the fulcrum along which these tectonic plates are shifting. And Xi Jinping has telegraphed every way he possibly can that it is not just an expression of ambition that he is targeting Taiwan. It is for his own political legitimacy and his own legacy that he is going after Taiwan. It's especially dangerous when you have both internal and external motives, and both offensive and defensive motives to do something. And Beijing has all of it with Taiwan. I take military and intelligence officials in Washington seriously when they say that he's given the order for the People's Liberation Army to be ready by 2027. And we need to do everything possible to make sure that the day never comes when he thinks he can win at an acceptable cost. Not only for the sake of Taiwan and for our sake, but for Japan. Japan's security will overnight be compromised if they get Taiwan. And President Trump needs to know that. Like, there's that final thing I'll say on this question. There's this one element in Josh Rogan's book, Chaos Under Heaven, where he got a scoop from a U.S. senator who was in the Oval Office with Trump when he was president. The topic of Taiwan came up, and Trump said, Taiwan is like what, I think he said like 8,000 miles away from America and like 2 feet away from China. If they ever invade, there's not a expletive thing we're going to do about it. That is not the kind of leadership that's going to win a Cold War. President Trump and his administration did great things in 2020 with China, but it's going to be even more dangerous and higher stakes now than it was then And if he's president, he's going to have to be ready.
Well, I think that note is the perfect lead in to our next question to hopefully lead us on a slightly more positive note. So thank you to the individual who sent this question in. What makes you hopeful for the future of the country in countering China?
One of my one of my favorite parts of the job I have right now at AFPC, um, if, any of you guys can go on my Twitter page. I make a lot of noise about China, about TikTok and just this and that. And a lot of it is exposing and calling out people who should know better as Americans, but are not putting the country's security interests first. But my one of my favorite parts of the job isn't that like uncomfortable rhetorical side of things. I've had the privilege of hosting private China dinners for senior congressional staff and senior Biden administration officials for about 2 years now. And it's been this little community of senior House and Senate staffers that regularly will gather about 6 times a year, and we'll get senior administration officials who have some part of the China portfolio. And it's an off the record conversation about how we're doing, what we're doing right, what we're doing wrong, and problems that need fixing. And I cannot adequately put into words, although I try to when I wrote the acknowledgments in my book, like this made it in there because seeing Republicans and Democrats not only be like, of course, when the cameras aren't off, like everyone who's in DC knows, like most people are pretty friendly in private, but seeing them problem solve together, not just across the partisan divide, but across the institutional divide with Congress and the executive, that has been such an honor to host and facilitate and to be a part of and to watch a cohort emerge over time and seeing people of good faith on both sides of the aisle who want to keep America safe and prosperous. That gives me hope. It really gives me hope because it's not the echo chamber of, like cable news media or Twitter shouting at each other. It's people who are breaking bread and trying to fix problems and keep Americans safe. So that gives me hope.
Well, and if I may, one of the things that gives me hope is that we have people like you who not only believe that the work is worth doing, but then also believe in the value of the American experiment and that protecting the American people is something worth doing. So thank you so much for the work that you're doing. Thank you for your time today. And if you would remind our participants where they can get your book.
Gladly. So, and thank you, Anne, for hosting and for this wonderful discussion. The book is Countering China's Great Game: A Strategy for American Dominance. You can get it on Amazon, or if you prefer to buy it from some other online retailer, you can find it in Walmart, Target, Barnes and Noble, but let's be real, Amazon.
Well, great. Thank you so much. We really appreciate your time today.
Thank you so much.
Of course.